Oh, thank you, Lisa. It really comes from the need that we have to engage as a community throughout the year, not just at a conference. And so we have the technology and we're a very global community. So being able to have these types of sessions, I think is really important for our scholarship, for challenging each other and for pushing each other forward. So I'm so glad that we're able to keep this off the ground, and welcome to the inaugural webinar. Get rid of that. So the NARST Presidential Webinar Series is really centered around a particular topic. And in this case, the topic is the presidential theme, which is unity and inclusion for global scientific literacy. Invite as a community and unite as a community. This is a theme. The presidential theme is usually just for the conference, and which is great. People don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to it until the conference happens. So the idea for this initiative is to keep the theme and the conversations related to this idea going through the year, and then it culminates at the conference when we can see each other in person, hopefully, and have some more discussion about this. But for those of you who may not know, the 2022 NARST conference is going to be held next March 27th through 30 in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is in the southwest corner of Canada. We are going to be in person, and hopefully you're going to be able to join us in person. If you are not able to join us in person, we will have a virtual option for you. So we want to be able to engage as many scholars as possible with the conference in our community. It's definitely our time to unite as a community of scholars and consider how our work can impact and achieve global scientific literacy. This particular session that we're having today is focused on inclusion and what that means. And certainly inclusion is important for global scientific literacy. Those in power positions too often can consider others as less than, as less important than. And I want to ask, how does NARST and other science education scholars move the scientific community towards a more inclusive perspective? How does NARST promote inclusive public image of science, where all are welcome, where all are valued, where we hold each other up, and we invite and unite as a community? These are things that we want to ponder during this session and as we continue on throughout the year. We have gathered a wonderful panel of young scholars, and I'm so excited to be able to introduce them to you. And I want to thank Lucy Abramadou for helping put this panel together. She knows a lot of people too, and it is great that we've been able to work together. And I love working with Lucy and being able to have this panel. That's my reminder to record. We are recording. I picked that up from a former doctoral student of mine. Reminder. Thank you, Melissa Shaney, if you're watching. All right, so today we're talking about disrupting the image of who can be a scientist. What does inclusion look like? What should inclusion look like? And here are our speakers for today. We have Katarina Gunter, who is pursuing a PhD in gender studies at Uppsala University, which is in Sweden. And she explores the norms and values, as well as imagined identities and identity trajectories in students' and teachers' figured worlds of higher education biology. We have Dr. Terrell Morton, who is an assistant professor of identity and justice and STEM education at the University of Missouri in Columbia, which is in the US. And his research focuses on identity as it informs the persistence and engagement of racialized and minoritized students in STEM post-secondary education. We have Mr. Scott Cohen, who is a PhD student in science education in the Department of Middle and Secondary Education at Georgia State University in the United States. His research focuses on science teaching and learning with deaf students. He aims to create inclusive science learning spaces for deaf students through sign language with a positive sense of belonging. He also works with classroom teachers to provide support so that they can construct meaningful science learning experiences for deaf students. And we have Ms. Emily MacLeod, who is a PhD student at the UCL Institute of Education in London, England. And her research uses longitudinal aspirations data to look at who does and who does not want to become a science teacher and why. And we have for our discussant today, Professor Dr. Lucy Avramidou, who holds a PhD in science education from Pennsylvania State University. She is currently the director of the Institute for Science Education and Communication at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Her work is associated with theoretical and empirical explorations of what it means to widen and diversify STEM participation through intersectional and identity-based approaches. We've got an amazing panel today. We're so excited. These are some of the questions that have been posed to them and that we're going to be digging into through this next 90 minutes. Who is invited into science, right? Who does the inviting? What does inclusion look like? What should inclusion look like? And who decides? And finally, I encourage everyone to think about how can our scholarship disrupt the community towards inclusivity and promote science identity development. So with that, I turn it over to Katarina. She will be our first speaker.
Thank you, Renee. I'm just going to try to share my screen. There you go. Can everybody see my screen? Good. All right. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, everybody. Also from my side, and thank you, Renee and NARST, for inviting me to be part of this inspiring group, panel, and webinar. My name is Katarina Gunter. I'm a PhD student at the Center for Gender Research at Uppsala University in Sweden, and I'm a first-generation university student and the first in my family to aspire a PhD degree. I've earned a bachelor's degree in biosciences from Heidelberg University and a master's degree in biology with a major in systematic biology from Uppsala University. And I've been a teaching assistant since my second year as an undergraduate in biosciences, both because I really needed to improve my economic situation, but especially because I've loved to be in exchange with others, share experiences, share competences, and make community. Being an assistant, however, also let me experience some tensions between university students and teachers, recognized ways of knowing, doing, being in biology, recognized ways of knowing, doing, and being in science. So my talk today is first inspired by two papers written and or published in the context of my PhD thesis. And then I would like to share a vignette with you, talking about and taking you into the field of doing university biology. So this is a quote, a student's quote from my first study. In their study motivation text, the student wrote, "Quite ironic that even I became a natural scientist. Quite ironic that even I became a scientist." Oops. Oh, my apologies. I'm just going to try to get this working again. Hold on a second. That's technical problems. There you go. Let's try this again.
Just while you're getting that set up, it looks like the chat is working. And also, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, right?
I think now we're back. That was a weird little bug. All right, so this was the student's quote. And so when reading this, I was looking up the definition of irony. So first, irony can be defined as the use of words to express something other than, and especially the opposite of the literal meaning. But it can also be an incongruity between the actual result of a sequence of events and the normal or expected result. Or it can even be an incongruity between a situation developed in a drama and in the accompanying words or actions that is understood by the audience, but not by the character in the play. And the quote, quite ironic that even I became a natural scientist, I interpreted in the sense of the second definition, but also feel reminded of the third. In the paper that discusses that quote further, we describe two imagined identity trajectories from students figuring the world of higher education biology. On the one hand, they figured a straight biology path in which students imagine a science career to begin with being a scientific child that becomes a self-evident science student in middle or high school, to then become an academic science student that has a narrow career goal within academia. Backpacking biology path students, on the other hand, want to use the breadth of biology as a discipline, as a resource to find out about their actual interests. They see themselves on winding educational roads and in between and among disciplines, transgressing disciplinary borders through living and combining their interests that go beyond biology and science, the scientific method towards transdisciplinary ways of knowing. And as one student phrased it, biology knowledge is to be put into a backpack. It becomes a resource, it is collected for a variety of contexts. What is important and what I want to highlight here is that while I believe that a diversity, including those two trajectories and going beyond them, is important, we found that it is only the backpacking students that negotiated their identities in relation to the straight biology paths, explicitly saying that as opposed to many other students, I do not have a certain talent. And as opposed to other students' paths, mine was anything but straight. As opposed to all these other students, I do not know what to do in my future. It is them that had to negotiate themselves in relation to a norm, a dominant imaginary, a hegemonic way of knowing, doing, being in the figured world of higher education biology. And it prompted even more so questions that I have been interested in. What ways of knowing, meaning the literacies, what ways of doing, meaning the practices, and what ways of being, meaning the identities, are considered intelligible and recognized in higher education biology and in higher education science. And in order to continue these explorations, we changed perspectives and analyzed biology teachers' teaching approach texts, focusing the lens on what both students and teachers' identities the teachers actually considered intelligible and recognized. Also here we describe two both opposing and overlapping identities. Research science teachers recognized ideas of transmitting knowledge from a more knowledgeable teacher to a less knowledgeable student, infusing good science and good science practice by being a scientist, and explicitly talking about teaching to be a gilt edge of being a scientist, an edge of being a scientist. Facilitating science teachers were highlighting to want to support students in developing their critical thinking. They recognize creating space for interdisciplinary interests and interdisciplinary students, and were considering teaching to be a skill that has to be learned, developed, acquired. As opposed to the research science teachers, they make a difference between the roles of a teacher to teach versus the role of their scientist selves to supervise. And it was interesting that they had in common to relate to science, not biology. Science is central to what the students have to learn, science to be an argument, science to support their point. Yet there was a difference in how they cared. While research science teachers cared about the students' knowledge of science and the scientific method, facilitating science teachers cared for the students' well-being and for the students' interests. So my work developed and started to include to ask what ways of caring, the care in the practice is recognized by both students and teachers. Who cares about, who cares for, who is allowed to care in what ways, and who wants to care in what ways. And all that thinking I do not want to take out of its context. And I want to thank and acknowledge companion thinkers, both those that I have met in person, those that so far I've only met virtually, and those that I have met through their writing. And now I want to change gears and want to take you into the field, not only when reflecting over all these great presentations tonight, but now when following this vignette, I would like to invite you to think about questions of who is invited, who does the inviting, who is invited to do the inviting, and who decides. It is the second time I rather spontaneously get asked to jump in as an examiner in a plant identification exam outdoors. The exam is a walk along which we make 15 stops where students have to identify up to 3 different flowering plants: ferns, horsetails, mosses, and lichens. They get a piece of paper with a table on it and have to fill in the table with the plant's scientific names in the right order. Swedish names don't count. Students are allowed to use a flora, a keying book for Swedish vegetation, which most of them mainly use to look up the very scientific names which they are supposed to write, because they only know the Swedish names by heart. During the first examination round this year, I guided 3 students who were granted more time per stop than other students for different reasons. 7 instead for 5 minutes. 2 more minutes, an inclusion measure. 2 minutes, an equity measure. During the first examination walk, a massive thunderstorm rolled over the fields and forests throughout our 1.5-hour walk. Students were fighting their umbrellas in the wind to protect their paper and themselves from getting soaked, trying to look up scientific names in books so thick that they are hard to hold in one hand, while standing or hovering under their umbrellas. Pens and pencils fall, papers rip, umbrellas break, students break. When thunder and lightning indicated the storm to be right above us, I called the responsible person and asked if we really should continue. His answer was yes. So we did. Weeks later, a second examination round. I again spontaneously get asked to supervise a student. It is one of the 3 students that had to repeat this exam, having 7 minutes. The student is nervous, even though they are knowledgeable and well-equipped. Rain clothes, a baseball hat, transparent envelopes to protect the examination paper from getting wet and ripping, and an umbrella, a big one, a new one. The moment we start the exam, it rains buckets again. Already at the first stop, it rains so much that there is no way for them to protect themselves, the paper, or the book from getting wet while using them at the same time. Again. Since it is only the 2 of us this time, I ask if I can help by holding the student's umbrella. They say yes. A routine develops. We arrive at a stop, I show them the plans. I take over the umbrella and follow the student's instructions. Sometimes we would walk up to the respective plans again. Sometimes I would also hold the keying book. Sometimes they ask me if what was written is actually readable, even with the holes punched into the wet paper with their pencils. Scientific names, punching holes. Then we walk and repeat. Eventually, it rains so heavily that their glasses fog up while looking at and trying to identify a horsetail. Now they can neither see, nor read, nor write. I tell them I can hold on to all their belongings as they clean their glasses. I can feel the students is getting frustrated, for good reason, and I do too. My feet are cold, my arms are heavy, and I feel this is unfair, especially for the student, but even for myself. Yet I know and see how much they have studied and want to pass this exam. I can relate. And we continue until the end, standing underneath the umbrella together. And I think about the irony of this while standing underneath the student's umbrella, an umbrella that says manpower. Thank you.
Katarina, well done. And now, Terrell.
Thank you so much, Katarina, for setting the stage. I was super excited to see several elements of your presentation, as I know that it will weave almost seamlessly into aspects that I will discuss in my presentation today. So hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Terrell Morton. I'm an assistant professor of identity and justice in STEM education here in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Missouri-Columbia. And I will be talking to you all today about this idea of countering and rejecting the master narrative, Black student engagement in post-secondary STEM. And so starting off this presentation with some facts and figures that we find, particularly here within the United States, that discusses Black students' enrollment and graduation rates in post-secondary science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so what this figure here communicates to us, coming from the National Science Foundation, is that over the course of about 10 years, 10 to 17 years, If we look here at this very small yellow line, we find that Black students are constantly being awarded degrees in science engineering around 10%. And while this figure itself gives a lot of insightful information, if we're thinking about degree awardment, across racial identity groups, if we think about that figure in relationship to data that comes from the National Center on Educational Statistics that talks about the number of students actually interested in majoring in a STEM degree, what we find here is that Black students enter into their 4-year college or universities expressing about 23% of them expressing interest in majoring in STEM, with yet this consistent graduation rate of 9%. And when you dive into the research literature to examine what is taking place between when they enter into their 4-year institutions and when they leave, there's a lot of theorizing and or discussing about the ways in which we create spaces, provide resources or support to engage Black students within STEM or ensure their inclusion. And as we look across that research literature and they talk about the different mechanisms that are offered to them, I see it almost as if it is a fairy godmother-like approach to the ways in which post-secondary STEM have been treating and engaging Black students. And what I mean by that fairy godmother approach is that we have the Black students who we perceive to be deficit, who we perceive to be destitute, who we perceive to be in need of transformation. We come in and we sprinkle a lot of our magic on these poor, destitute Black students. We help transform them and their individual selves into sort of this phenomenal, quote unquote, individual who can then go and enter into the community of science or post-secondary STEM, being able to have a seat at the table that we've created in our various communities. And as I'm looking and I'm thinking about how research is discussing Black students in relationship to post-secondary STEM and seeing the ways in which our resources and our mechanisms from a community-wise have been distributed and or communicated with regards to their Black student engagement, I question to some degree how it is that we've come up to this mindset of engaging Black students from this very deficiency-based model. And so through my own positionality, thinking about the identities that I inhabit, the various privileges that I've been able to gain as a result of my identities, the exposures and the awareness that I've incurred across my lifespan, and how these three things have then led to the commitments that I have expressed, the goals that I have set for myself through my research and through my practice, and how said commitments then transmit into actions, I am guided primarily by these two theoretical frameworks in thinking about how we are theorizing and understanding Black students, their identity expressions and engagement, and the post-secondary STEM education context. Phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, being devised by Margaret Bell Spencer and colleagues out of the University of Chicago, talks about the intimate relationship between conceptions and understandings of the self in relationship to larger ecosystem or environment, and the ways in which the norms, the practices, the beliefs, and the value systems of that environment trickle down and infiltrate how individuals perceive, interpret, and understand themselves in relationship to their outcomes and their engagements. And I couple this particular framework with critical race theory, a framework that is very intentional to talk about the permanence and presence and the systematic structural nature of racism embedded particularly within the United States context, given its founding that allowed the forced extermination of the indigenous and the forced enslavement of African bodies, and how that mindset then trickles through all of the various social institutions and the ways that those social institutions engage Black people or other racially minoritized individuals. And so when I combine both critical race theory and PVEST, I am looking then at the ways in which Black students are interacting and engaging within their post-secondary STEM environments, where the identities that they are born with, born into, or acquire over time, then shape the various stress engagements that they perceive and experience within their STEM learning spaces. Those stress engagements then elicit reactive coping mechanisms. So they're responding to how they're understanding their larger STEM context. And as they're continuously generating those reactive coping mechanisms, they are developing for themselves an identity, how they understand what it means to be Black within a science space then leads to this emergent identity that they then embody. But as they are embodying this emergent identity and making these perceptions based off of what they see and understand, there are also those larger social forces and structures that are attempting to project onto them an emergent identity, which then impacts and influences their overall life stage outcomes, their decisions to stay, their decisions to leave, where they graduate, how they then matriculate, which in this very reciprocal fashion then contributes to these broader stereotypical notions or biases about Black identities or Black women's identities and how we understand them in relationship to the STEM context. And you will note here that not only do we see this specific figured world, for lack of a better word, for Black students, but we see how this same concept is operating on our various faculty and our staff and the conceptions of scientists or STEM professionals that are being communicated more broadly, and the ways in which the reactive coping mechanisms of those empowered positions across our four-year institutions are impacting the stress engagements and the reactive coping mechanisms of our students, and to some degree, vice versa, how the reactive coping mechanisms of the students are then impacting the stress engagements of the faculty, staff, and administrators. But what's even more interesting outside of these very individual localized figured worlds is that these spaces are taking place within these broader structures as we think about the classroom space as an ecosystem, as we think about how the classroom space is embedded within a specific department that has its own set of rules and regulations, and how departments are then embedded within institutions, and institutions then sit within these broader conceptions of how we understand science or STEM or the various countries and nations that our learning spaces are in. And so when I think about this within the context of the US, I find that our Black students are positioned in spaces where they're operating from these broader norms and values that position and regulate Black as inferior. These policies and procedures that render Black as deficient, and these individualized beliefs and perspectives that operate from this very colored, gendered blind approach. And if we think about how and why this is taking place within this context of science, it is because of this broader social, political, historical culture of science that comes from ideologies where there were explicit attempts to prove racism and reinforce social hierarchies based off of people's supposed morphology or geographic location, where our various methodological practices are rooted in perspectives where Black people were considered to be lesser than the physical property of, and therefore experimented on in various ways that then contribute to this broader praxis of supposed objectivity or individualism or competition that is communicated through how we talk about science, how we support science, how we measure science, or even scientific success. And so this social, political, historical culture of science, if we take it out even one step larger, is connected to this broader culture of whiteness and Western colonialism. where through the practices of colonialism, we see the physical and cultural imperialism that was taking place globally and the epistemic injustice and dejection of the indigenous and ancestral ways of knowing, doing, and being as a way to create this new conception of normality, as a way to enforce this dominant hegemonic perspective of being, existing, knowing, ethics, and practices. And so it's usually around this time when I'm talking about my research and how I am examining Black student engagement in relation to these broader societal norms and values that people pose the question of, now what? If I am making this connection between how someone is showing up in this space and the various structures and forces that are operating on them, what should I do and how should I respond? And so to that question, answering this idea of what inclusion should look like, it is this idea of taking dialogic action, where we are embracing the fact that racism is real, that there is gendered racism and structural oppression that is ingrained within the very fabrics of how we are conceiving ourselves and this space that we are operating within. We are exploring our own individual positionalities within this phenomena of science, bounded by and influenced by structural racism and gendered racism, raising our critical consciousness, being exposed to the different ways of knowing, doing, and being that exist, giving people standpoints and the various philosophies that they ascribe to, and then collectively coming together to take action, recognizing that the oppressed can help suggest and lead these endeavors, but those who are in the majority, those who are recognized as the dominant group, those who maintain the power, have to be a co-conspirator in this movement to truly disrupt this idea of this standard norm of science. And so I invite you all to check out some of the projects that I am engaged with, as well as look at some of the publications that I have associated with this practice, as we continue to raise this question of how can we disrupt science, how we can foster inclusion, and how we can even rethink the ways in which we are engaging Black students within our post-secondary STEM spaces.
Thank you, Terrell. Wonderful presentation. And next we have Scott Cohen.
Okay, let me make sure I have my screen set here. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us today. I am happy to be here and on the panel. Before we get going, I wanted to let you know if you're interested in seeing me present, you would need to switch to gallery view. Because Zoom won't highlight my box since I am not using my voice today and my audio isn't on. If you switch to gallery view, you will be able to see me sign my presentation. Today's title is, I don't know if hearing people or if the hearing person can see things the same way if they don't have the language. I have been involved in a summer STEM camp, which led to me being involved in my PhD, pursuit of PhD, and my study and research. During that time of being involved in the STEM camp, I found this quote and felt like it was applicable to this presentation. As I dig into research, specifically looking at the tie between the deaf community and deaf identity in the field of sciences. So maybe you're asking yourself, who am I? Who's this white guy who is presenting today? What does he have to tell us about changing up the norms in science and disrupting the norms in the science field? I will let you know that I am deaf. And so that has already removed me from that top white cisgendered male category of most scientists. You know, so when we're talking about gender, race, and class, you know, one of those things for me within the Western modern science is you will not find many deaf individuals within the variety of sciences. So I've started out a lot of my research, taking a look at myself, analyzing my own journey. So I've made this slide here to talk about that. I did make a presentation last year at ESARA. And Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Avramadou were both in attendance there. And I thought, wow, what a fascinating session to learn through what has brought me here, what has contributed to my science journey, what even led me to science in the first place, which has led me to create this timeline. As a student, I thought, you know, I was probably about average in science. It didn't really capture my attention like some students. So in thinking through that, I thought, you know, I was born in Hawaii. Oh, I did want to mention that. Yes, I was born and raised in Hawaii, and of course, surrounded then by the natural beauty, I'm sure you can imagine, you know, and really interested in conservation work and restoration work when it comes to the natural sciences. Honestly, looking back, I was hoping to live and work in Hawaii. And, you know, if I was going to be successful doing that, I think I should have picked tourism instead of natural science conservation work. But there's a lot of effort with preservation. That is to be expected, of course, but there's not a lot of money in that field. So I experienced many internships, but I was unable to get a job in biology. I wasn't really sure why that was. Is that because I was deaf? I am deaf because of people's own fears and limitations of thinking about what if he can't hear an alarm? How will we communicate? What if things are missed? I'll never know the actual answer of what provided those barriers from me entering biology, but it did lead to a change in career for me. And so I shifted into education with the ultimate goal of bridging the gap between the deaf community and the sciences communities. And so when we're looking at the science community, we're looking at what you know, deaf people have access to. There's less resistance, there's less of a stigma, less assumptions made. And having already been a part of the deaf community, I was aware of what I was facing then in the science field. And so figured I knew what I could expect becoming a science teacher and to teach deaf students. But, you know, to be honest, that wasn't the most authentic way for me to achieve my overall vision. Being in the classroom has its own limitations. You know, being within the local school system, there's a lot to navigate. And I realized that my dream expanded outside of that box of just being in the classroom. So upon doing further examination of my own goals and hopes, I shifted into research and studying, and almost having a higher approach within education to see what's missing. What are the gaps in deaf education when it comes to science? What is there? What is not there when it comes to science education? And I know that there are gaps that have been identified within science education, you know, K through 12 to begin with, but then specifically for our deaf students, there are a lot of missing pieces. You know, there are a lot of factors to consider when you're considering the background of the students, what else is going on in their lives. Maybe they're deaf students who are also dealing with other disabilities. And all of those things need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at the education of the deaf students. So I have been working on my PhD program now and learning many statistics in dealing with the deaf community as it comes to science and being scientists. And there are a couple different perspectives, honestly. One perspective of the deaf community within science is to say they are a unique people group. They have their own culture. They have their own language. The other opposite perspective is that they are a group who are disabled and who need to be fixed. And so that wide spectrum has followed us through the decades within the field of science. And you know, we have to consider, who are the gatekeepers? Who gets to decide? Is that the medical diagnosis that decides? Can we only progress if we are hearing? Or is there an adaptation to use our language within the field and find growth that way? And one of the uniquenesses of being deaf is that it crosses a variety of boundaries. It crosses genders, it crosses race and class. You will find deaf individuals in all of these spaces. And so to look at the impact and the global impact really from the deaf individuals within the field, it's critical to have our voice in this space. So then when looking at deaf individuals who pursue science at the variety of educational levels, and to see, you know, as school progresses, who continues on. So we see numbers, we see high numbers in high school, we see high numbers in undergraduate programs, we even see numbers in grad programs, and then it drops almost completely off the map when it comes to the PhD programs. You'll see a large percentage of these students getting their, you know, core classes done in science, but then the numbers are almost non-existent when it comes to deaf individuals pursuing a PhD in science fields. So this photo is a group of my campers who came to the Deaf STEM camp. It was an amazing group of students. Most of them were actually my former students. I was a high school teacher. And so it was great to be able to reconnect with them again and to have an experience with them outside of the classroom high school setting. There were some issues that we found during our study and during that week at camp, specifically as it came to their experience with STEM and STEM activities. This group of students, they all attend a school that has over 80% BIPOC student population, and as well as adults, showing them, you know, that there are heroes to be looked up to. So while the students are majority people of color, they do not see the equal representation of adults in the fields that they're interested in. So as we look to see where are those people of representation, how can we bring them in? How can we expose these students? How can we show them that they can be successful in these STEM fields? We really struggled to find those individuals within each of the fields. And then again, to add on the element of deafness on top of that, being deaf people of color was an additional challenge. And then I just wanted to touch a little bit on the deaf perspective within science and how critical our perspective is here in scientific conversations within the work that is being done. Oftentimes, there are huge assumptions made about deaf students, and to assume that they are the exact same as their hearing counterparts, but they just don't have their hearing. And it's really more complex than that. It's how they see the world. It's how their brain processes the information that they're taking in. It's our collective experience. It's our shared language through a visual language that's represented in 3D space on our hands. All of that comes into play when we're studying science as deaf individuals. And I have learned that there are 3 stages, or a 3-stage model of emancipation. Historically, the deaf community has been very isolated. They have been kept away in deaf sports teams, in deaf schools, in deaf clubs where they meet and socialize. Everything is insulated because they have the language and ability to communicate with each other. It tends to stay in a closed, locked setting. Right now, we're starting to notice sign language more out in the open. It's more prevalent. You're seeing it in more places. Some of those locked systems are opening up. Even though deaf people have used sign language for many years, decades upon decades, we are still missing big pieces of information in teaching our deaf individuals how to communicate within the sciences. What are the specific signs that we use and can use to represent these scientific ideas and concepts? And so we talk about then the second stage is, or I've mentioned the second stage is the legitimacy of sign language. It's being recognized as a language. And so then moving on to the new generation of hope as a pluralistic society of welcoming multiple users of languages to minimize harm within the community and have a season or a time of reparation within the community to have a variety of languages represented and welcomed. Just wanted to expose you here with this slide to a couple of deaf scientists who are very well known. Annie Jump Cannon, you'll see her picture here. She is a previous employee, a staff member of Harvard. And she worked within the department studying the universe, studying stars. And that was at a time that computers, that was pre-computers. And she was a woman scientist. And so she had worked to develop a variety of photos that were taken. I believe she is credited with photos of over 300,000 stars. The bottom 2 pictures you will see are current modern day deaf scientists. One is a deaf NASA engineer. And the other scientist you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner is Jordan Stark, is a particle physicist. And so we're seeing some connections being made slowly, some representation within science of deaf scientists to say, oh gosh, we are represented here. We do have historic deaf scientists as well as current modern day scientists. Thank you so much. I appreciate your attention today.
Thank you, Scott. And now we will hear from Emily.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. Okay, so welcome. My name is Emily MacLeod and I'm a PhD researcher at UCL Institute of Education in London. And firstly, thanks for sticking around this long. So I'm the last presenter this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. And today's webinar has all been about so far disrupting the image of who can be a scientist, but applying that to my own research today, I'm going to change it a little bit and talk about disrupting the image of who can be a science teacher. So first, I want to start by asking you, what is the typical image of a science teacher? So asked to think of a science teacher, you might be able to conjure up the image of one of your own science teachers, or you may have in mind a well-known science teacher. So in preparation for today, I tried, but really struggled to think of what is this typical science teacher. And the best thing I could come up with using Google were some poor examples of Walter White from Breaking Bad and Miss Frizzle from The Magic School Bus, though I'm not completely sure whether or not she taught other subjects as well. And you may or may not have heard of these, and please do feel free to get in touch with me if you've got some better suggestions. But this difficulty in identifying the typical science teacher isn't, I think, because just anyone can fit into the image of a science teacher, but it's because this is such a contested image. So to demonstrate this, I want to remind you of today's focus, which is scientists. And I want to recognize that science teachers might not neatly fit into the role of scientist in everyone's minds. But why is that? So my own research is based in England, where 75% of teachers identify as female, and most come from less advantaged backgrounds. However, as we know, scientists more typically identify as male and tend to come from very advantaged backgrounds. And indeed, it's not only that most teachers identify as female and most scientists identify as male, but the image of teaching is associated with feminine traits such as caring, whereas the image of science is more associated with masculine traits. However, it is worth noting that something that both of these words share is that traditionally there are very few ethnic minorities in both teaching and in science. But these, in some cases, contrasting images of teachers versus scientists raises this question: where do science teachers fit? And what is the image of a science teacher? And how does this image influence who is included within science teaching? So first, why am I talking about science teachers when today's webinar is about scientists? So first, in order to have scientists, we, of course, first need those who will teach them science in school. But secondly, we don't have enough of them. There's a severe shortage of science teachers in many countries. And I should say here that by science teacher, I mean school teachers at a secondary level with a specialism in any of the scientists, though I do think that there are some similarities here with, for example, what Katarina was talking about at a higher education level. And there are two main reasons for this shortage of school science teachers. First, the low retention of existing science teachers, but also the low recruitment of new science teachers. And it's this recruitment issue that is the focus of my research, because I look at young people who might want to go on to become science teachers. And for context, in England, the most common route to becoming a new science teacher is to do an undergraduate degree in the sciences and then choose afterwards to complete a postgraduate year of teacher training. So to look at this, I'm very lucky to be using data from the Aspires project led by Professor Louise Archer. And Aspires is a mixed method study which has tracked science and career aspirations of over 45,000 young people to date. And the project started when the cohort of young people were all 10, and they've just turned 22. So I'm using this longitudinal data to look at what is the typical image of a science teacher, and who sees themselves as a potential future science teacher and why. And here I'm using the lens of identity, and I'm arguing that in order to express an aspiration to become a teacher growing up, a person must identify as a potential future science teacher, at least a little bit. So today I've chosen to speak to you about just one young person from my PhD research and the wider Aspire sample called Joanne. And I have interviewed data from Joanne at each of these time points marked on the timeline, and from her parents at all but one of these time points. And this gives me a really rich qualitative data set about Joanne's aspirations growing up, and importantly, what shaped them. So Joanne identifies as female and white British, and she grew up in England living with her parents, both of whom left school at 16. Her mom, Judy, referred to herself as a housewife throughout the length of the Aspires project. And Joanne's dad, Matthew, originally worked in financial services and later retrained to work in mental health. So on this timeline, I first highlighted some educational milestones to tell you a bit more about Joanne. So she started secondary school, she studied for her GCSE exams and then did her A-level exams, and then went on to do a natural sciences degree. And finally, she's just completed a master's in biological scientists. And with that information, no prizes for guessing that scientist was one of Joanne's aspirations growing up. However, she did not end up becoming a scientist, and she decided against this route while she was at university. Instead of being a scientist, Joanne is what I've termed this potential future teacher. And this is because first, Joanne aspired to teach science when she was 12, and again later when she was 20. And in addition, Joanne performed multiple, what I would call teacher-like roles, science teacher-like roles. So for example, she worked in science communication, she worked as a science tutor, both in a school setting to groups and one-to-one. And importantly, Joanne reported enjoying each of these experiences. And Joanne actually applied to become a science teacher when she left university, and she was invited to interview. However, she has instead started training to become a lawyer, though she did tell me that she did feel some sadness about kind of closing the door on teaching science. So why did Joanne come so close to becoming a science teacher and then turn her back on it? And what does this have to do with the image of science teachers? So here I'm using the lens of recognition because I think that it can tell us a lot about this image of the science teacher and who is or is not included within it. And this concept of recognition of science identities comes from, of course, Cohen and Johnson, and most recently, Lucy, who is our discussant today's most recent paper on the politics of recognition in science. And it's based on this idea that our identities are shaped with and by others, not just ourselves. And it's this, this recognition is also not neutral, but informed by political and cultural influences. And specifically, what was clear from Joanne's longitudinal data was a regular lack of recognition for her identity as a potential science teacher. In other words, Joanne didn't fit the image of a science teacher according to others. And on this timeline, I've highlighted some instances of this, though these are just a few examples, and I should emphasize that this is not Joanne's whole story. So first, when Joanne was 13, which was around the time when she first aspired to teach, Judy said in her own interview about Joanne that she couldn't see her teaching. When Joanne was older, just before she started university, Judy again spoke about Joanne as a science teacher. This time she acknowledged that Joanne liked the teaching experiences that she'd had to date, but she still didn't recognize Joanne as a teacher. She said, she is teaching the chemistry at school, and she seems to quite enjoy that, which whether she would teach children, I don't know. Later, Matthew also referred to teaching as probably a last resort for Joanne. And what's more, Joanne told me that her university only ever gave her careers advice about becoming a scientist. So despite the fact that we need a lot more people with science degrees going into teaching, she also wasn't recognized as a potential teacher by her university. And it was clear that Joanne took on board this lack of recognition. For example, she told me that although her parents knew that she had an interest in teaching, she knew that they wanted her to work in science, not as a teacher. She also highlighted the lower status that teaching has compared to science. For example, by telling me that she thought her parents would think she was better than teaching, and she thought that they would think teaching would be a waste of her science knowledge. And this in turn fed into Joanne's own doubts about how she would fit into the role of science teaching. And this is again, despite her significant experience in these science teaching-like roles. And here I would argue that although Joanne's white and female identities are typical of the common image of a teacher in England, for Judy, Matthew, and Joanne's university, it was Joanne's identity as a potential scientist that they saw as at odds with her potential teaching identity. So for them, because they saw her as a scientist, she couldn't be a teacher. And this was despite her interest and experience in science teaching. So what does this tell us about the image of science teaching? First, it's clear that the image of a science teacher fits neither within the image of a scientist nor within the image of a teacher. And I'm not here to argue that it should be fitting within either, but this makes it difficult for people to see themselves fitting within the image of teaching science. And specifically, the gendered, classed, and racialized image of both teaching and science can be a real barrier to this. And secondly, my longitudinal data show that even where someone does want to teach science, this contested image of a science teacher makes it difficult for them to maintain this aspiration. So in the case of Joanne, even though she could see herself teaching science at various points growing up, her recognition as a scientist by others ended up playing a part in her not seeing herself as a science teacher. So I'll finish up by returning to the question I first posed, but changing it slightly. So if the current image of a science teacher is so contested and confused that it means that people like Joanne turn away from science teaching, instead of what is the typical image of a science teacher, what should be the typical image of a science teacher? I'll leave that one for the discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emily. Well done. All right, now we will hear from Lucy Avramidou, our discussant. Take it away, Lucy. Lucy, you're muted.
Thank you, Renee. Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us from different parts of the world. I'm very grateful to be provided with the privilege of serving as a discussant in this wonderful session. I also like to acknowledge my intellectual humility in following on this amazing work done by these researchers. A little bit about me. I have engaged in identity-based work for the past 8 years. And my work, like many other researchers, builds heavily from the seminal work done by Professor Carlon in the US, and specifically the identity model proposed in 2007. Now, since then, the construct of identity has been conceptualized and used in different ways to frame research related to questions. Who is a scientist? Who can be a scientist? Who is recognized as a scientist? Who is included in science and who is excluded from science? What I would like to do in the next 10 minutes is to first offer a set of personal reflections on the theme of the webinar. I will then briefly attempt to synthesize my take-home messages from the 4 presentations. I will discuss what I would have liked to know more from the presenters and why. And I will end by sharing some thoughts about the possible future of identity-based research. Starting from the main theme of the webinar, disrupting the image of who can be a scientist. I would argue that before we start thinking about ways of disrupting the image of who can be a scientist, we need to first better understand what is it exactly that we want to disrupt. And these interrelated questions are crucial to me. Who is allowed in science? Who is a producer of scientific knowledge? Who is recognized as a successful science learner or a science person? Who is made vulnerable? And essentially, what identities are deemed in place and what identities are deemed out of place. And here is another crucial question, perhaps more practical one. What do we actually mean by disrupting? I think that a lot of people who are here today would argue that we need to disrupt the status quo, traditional, narrow, and exclusionary ways of how science and scientists have been represented. So then the question for me becomes one of, are we aiming to disrupt entire social systems of oppression? Are we aiming to dismantle the academic system? Are we trying to overturn teacher education programs? Are we trying to get rid of entire curricula? And if so, where do we start from? Is there something that is already being done that could build on? And here is one suggestion. I think that a departure point for identity-based research will be the research area of the nature of science, and specifically contemporary conceptualizations of the nature of science that brings together constructs at different levels, including the personal, social, cultural, and political, but also brings together concepts from different disciplines such as philosophy, political economy, and the sciences. And one example of that is found in the work of Professor Duran with the family resemblance approach to the nature of science. This is a very brief introduction into my own thoughts of the webinar. Now I'm going to try to attempt to synthesize the main ideas of the 4 presentations. And there are 2 main ideas that stood out for me. One has to do with the nature of identities and the emphasis on becoming versus being. And this is a recent trend in identity-based research. We saw data in the presentations that provide evidence of the intersectional nature of identity, the partial, incomplete, paradoxical, contradictory, competing, lived and imagined nature of identity. The second one has to do with the value of identity, which is something that cut across all the presentations. And for me, the value of identity as evidence in the ideas and the data presented today is found in the following. First, identity can give meaning to the process of becoming a science person, and at the same time shed light on issues related to power, inequality, racism, and exclusion in science. Identity capitalizes on lived experiences and provides a dynamic, fluid, complex, and multidimensional unit of analysis in ways that other constructs are not able to do. Identity illustrates how cognition, thinking, or meaning are inextricable from feelings, emotions, and sense. And lastly, identity demonstrates that learning and experience are intrinsically situated in a matrix of life trajectories and ecological aspects through someone's life. The work that we saw today capitalizes either explicitly or implicitly on the construct of possible selves. And here I want to share a few thoughts on this. In my understanding, the construct of possible selves has been used in identity-based research to examine the ideal selves that we would like to become in the future. The scientist, the science teacher, the successful learner, and so on. Now, I would argue that the limitation in this conceptualization is that it is possible that we remain oblivious to the selves that we are afraid of becoming, which goes beyond aspirations and motives to include fears and threats as well. Such a conceptualization is important in my view because it will help us to deconstruct binaries around success and failure, who is a science person, who is not a science person. And I think that would lead to an understanding of how identity is both socially constructed and deeply political. There are two things that I would have liked to know more about from the panelists, and especially from Katarina and Emily. One has to do with positionality, and specifically responses to these questions. Who are you? Who are you in relation to your work? Why are you doing this kind of work? In what ways do your multiple identities position you in your work? What do you purposefully decide to see or not see within your research data? And what do you unconsciously see or not see within your data? These are questions that I also pose to myself in any research project that I engage. Essentially, what I'm doing here is inviting everyone to think about this question. How do you position yourselves in the axis of privilege and oppression? And how does this positioning shape and influence your work? What I also wish I'd known more from more presentations is the role of place in their work. Specifically, I would have liked to know a bit more about the geosociopolitical characteristics of your unique context, the diversity that exists within the US, and how racism and inequalities manifest in different places across the country. I would also have liked to know a bit more about England and Sweden's colonial past and how they find or not their place in the curriculum and how they influence the research that you do. And essentially, I would have liked to get a better sense of how your work is contextualized in national histories as well as social movements. So the question I'm inviting you to engage with here is, how does time and place shape your work? I will end with a few thoughts into the future, if I can, which are actually a set of questions. The first one is whether identity is still a useful construct to use. And in thinking about this question, I think that it might be useful to look at other fields of research. And here is one example that I found really useful in my work. Is work done in mathematics education by Dr. Nicole Joseph, who uses the construct of humanity, which is a much more comprehensive and relational in nature than identity. The second question I would like to pose is whether everyone has to be a science person, and if not, how does that type of identity negotiation might look like? And here is an example of work that I found very useful. This is a recently published paper by Kate, James, Natalie King, and Renee. The third one is whether current conceptualizations of identity have failed, perhaps, to capture identity in movement and across places. And here is a recently published piece that engages with this question. This is from work done in Canada that precisely addresses this question, or the question associated with the role of place and time in identity development. And the last one is the role that different theories play in our conceptualization and examination of identity. Useful work that I found in the US is the work done by Felicia Moore, and how she uses critical theory, especially in the context of teacher education, to examine identity development. And another example, this is from work done in Canada by Alison Gonsalves, who uses the construct of science capital, which is also used in the UK quite a lot from the group of Emily, and how, so yeah, in a way I'm trying to think how these different theories find their place in our context, and whether we perhaps need to consider crossing borders and see if how these different theories might find their place in our context. And I will end with a recommendation, or rather an invitation, because this is kind of very open in my own head as well. It's not something that I engage deeply with. So this is an invitation for researchers looking into questions of access and inclusion in science, and use identity as a lens. I would urge us to consider moving towards an embodied model of identity, where the body and place are central to the reflective project of identity. And I would like to argue that we haven't done such a great job in examining the role of body and place in identity development, myself included. Is there value in that? I will argue that, yeah, there is great value in that, because viewing identity as an embodied experience will provide us with the tools to explore the inseparability between the body and the self. And this has the potential to highlight the centrality of place or places on identity development. And second, in order to understand the embodied identity, we need to pose questions of what bodies mean, but what bodies can do. And this demands the development of strategies for theorizing lived bodies. And I think, again, this is an area, research area, that we haven't engaged as much as we should have. This is important, I think, because this will highlight the centrality of positionalities and subjectivities of us as researchers. Now we'll end with this. I think we need to, in order to do all this, I think we need to engage more thoroughly and deeply with intersectionality. I will leave it here. Thank you all very much. We will now open it up for a discussion, which I will try to facilitate with the help of Renee. We already have a few questions in the question and answers, and I will start from those, even though I see a few of them have already been answered. I see a couple of questions that kind of address this issue of what constitutes a domain being classified as science, and whether we need to be thinking or getting rid of labels such as basic and applied science, formal, informal science, and so on. And I think that Katarina already started engaging with this question. Katarina, would you like to share more on this?
Yeah, I've been currently thinking about also the questions that you've been mentioning about who we are and who we are in relation to our work. Would you mind if I take that up as we're speaking and discussing? Because I've been thinking a lot about transitionings and transgressings, and me in relation to my work, as that was part of the question. And I've been thinking a lot about my own transgressions, my own transitionings from biology into gender studies, yet doing educational research. So I'm in between and among and all these different disciplines, research paradigms. And from the beginning, I started to think about objectivities and subjectivities, coming from a field where you constantly talk about the objectivity of us, and moving into a field where we're constantly talking about the subjectivities of us, and then combining these, or trying to negotiate these ideas of transgressing objectivities, transgressing subjectivities, research paradigms and disciplines. And I would just like to comment on the embodiment of this, the embodied experiences, as I try to highlight in these vignettes. And these vignettes will hopefully be part of my entire PhD thesis in order to position myself and to make myself vulnerable as well, to try to give up this idea of objectivity, moving into subjectivities, positioning myself, visualizing my position, visualizing my lived experiences to some extent, and also trying to be very open about how it physically felt to be in certain spaces in certain times. So that I wanted to add to this question. And then I'm happy to move forward.
Thank you, Katarina. This was very useful. Yeah, please, if you can take a pass on this first question that seems to be embedded in different comments and questions that I see here.
Is that open for anyone, or?
Do you want to go first, Terrell?
In terms of the first question or this next question?
The first question, what constitutes a domain being classified as science?
Yes, so, within my work, it connects to this idea of this culture of whiteness and Western colonialism, and how science, what we deem as science, is actually a very Western Eurocentric cultural practice of science, because we also know that there is indigenous science. We know that there's Afrocentric science. We know that there is feminist science. And so there are multiple ways in which we can actually begin to unpack how we understand the natural world if we distill science down to this process of understanding the natural world. But the rules, the norms, the expectations, the metrics for success, the beliefs, the value systems that are all encompassed around what we typically hallmark as science is based very much within this Western Eurocentric ideology that is connected to this global colonization processes and this culturally imperialistic mindset, again, of conceptions of normality. And so if we truly begin to disrupt that, then we can look beyond science within a formal place like a school system, a research lab, higher education, to understanding the multiple ways in which people are processing and exploring and attempting to predict and understand the natural world, which then shifts even this broader conception of who can do science and who is recognized as a scientist.
Great, Terrell, thank you. Anyone else wants to take a pass on this question? Scott?
Yeah, I don't mind speaking to that. That would be great. I would like to follow up a little bit in thinking through how science within schools is learned, what that content knowledge is, who decides what that content is, how students are labeled as successful even within the schooling system. So giving them honors, respecting the system that they're coming up in has been a traditional view of the world. It's not just about knowing science, but it's about interacting with people as a part of science, as a part of their environment. Communication comes to play, thinking and hypotheses and theories come to play. It's so much more than just this Western European colonialism that's happened of just knowing these terms, of meeting these metrics. And once I've met these metrics, then I'm ready to go out into the world as a scientist. But that really, these metrics then are reflecting, who we have now produced as scientists and why that is so homogenous.
Great, thank you, Scott. I'm going to move on to another set of questions, and I would like to ask Emily or Katarina if they want to take this on. So this is a question about, trying to summarize it here. Are there lessons to learn from cases of success? So this is a question that is situated in the context of the US, but I would like you to, if you can, take a pass on it and say, what do we have to learn from cases that are defined as cases of success from your work, Katarina and Emily?
I'll take that. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you. That's a good one. I'll be honest, with my small sample, I would count the cases of success as people from my sample who went on to become a science teacher. And as yet, I have none. So we've got a few people who are open to science, which I find really encouraging, open to science teaching, which I find really encouraging. And like Joanne, there's a few people who just get stuck for a bunch of these reasons, including this recognition and the wider culture of teaching and science and how they all fit together. And there are a couple of people like Joanne as well who've applied to be science teachers, and then something's happened. So bear with me on that success one, and I might come back to you in the future. I just wanted to pick up on something that was said earlier as well with this. So, and you mentioned about our own positionality, Lucy, and that's something that was missing perhaps from my own presentation. So I was a former school teacher, but I didn't teach science, and my own teacher identity is quite strong, but my science identity is not as strong at all. I've not studied science beyond age 15 or 16. And I obviously bring that with me when I speak to the young people about where their science degrees will take them. And like Scott said, I think the school science curriculum at school will obviously shape their own identities and where they see science taking them. And as I mentioned in my presentation, for example, Joanne's experience of learning science at a university setting was, oh, now you go on to become a scientist or a researcher and not anything else, and it gets much more narrowed down. But from my own point of view, that's not my experience as a non-scientist. I'll pass on to someone else. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. But if I can follow on that, so you have an amazing set of longitudinal data. And I'm wondering if you have any evidence in that data that speaks to specific times of these participants' lives that were crucial in any way, or to specific people in their lives that seem to be impactful in how they see themselves or how they're recognized as science persons.
Thank you. I think that, well, as you say, I'm very lucky to have such a rich data set. And on top of tracking these young people as they've got older for more than half their lives, we've spoken to their parents almost every time as well. And I think that's really unique in such a data set. And that not only gives me the parental view and how they see the family life, but also allows me to kind of go in between them. So the main people I look at the moment during my analysis are the parents, but I definitely always ask people as well the role of their own teachers. And I've been really shocked at how much people remember their own teachers when they've been thinking about teaching. I don't have that memory myself. I've got a bad memory of my own school and teachers. So I think own teachers and own parents are really strong, but I'm definitely going to look out for other things as well, because there are key transitions such as careers education or lack of, which are definitely kind of pathways and crossroads as well.
Thank you. Katarina?
May I give that question a twist? Because I've been thinking about, Terrell was posing the question, how do we measure success? And that is connected to your question, right? But I'm also thinking about who is it that measures the success? And I followed up on these study motivation texts from my first study and actually interviewed some of these students. And for some, it was only like 2 years after they wrote their text. For some, it was more than just 2 years. So they could actually compare. I let them read the text when I was interviewing them, so I could see the reaction of them towards their past selves and what they imagined back then they would do in their futures and what their aims were. And I could see how they were measuring their own success by sort of translating what they did into what they have been doing now and comparing that, and they were actually seeing themselves as very successful when they were still doing what they have been writing about in the past. But then we were also continuing these interviews independent from these texts. And so in some way we touched upon these ideas of measuring success, and I would measure success in a sense that I would let them measure their own success. It's not about me measuring how successful they have become, but how successful they have felt they could be, and if they were supported in becoming successful. And I think that was just mind blowing when I was talking to them, and it really changed my study as well.
Thank you, Katarina. I see another question that I think it's important to address. So in the work that we saw, but also in the majority of identity-based research so far has engaged with research that aims to characterize identity trajectories. But we haven't seen much work on curriculum design or specific instructional practices that support the development of science identities. And I'm wondering if you have examples from work in your context, programs or specific curriculum materials that or design considerations that address explicitly the development of science identities, especially in secondary school. Can I start with Terrell?
So I think that this is a really good question. And I know that schooling is very place-based in a sense that depending on your nation or your country's rules or regulations, there are different norms and practices. And even within the United States, we see that because education is a state's right, that we have differences in how we even understand science education across the 50 states and occupied territories that is a part of the United States. But when I think about some of the work of like Dr. Natalie King down at Georgia State, who's doing research to talk about how are we understanding sort of these informal learning spaces and the relationship between informal science and formal science. Or if I think about some of the work of some of the other scholars that you highlighted as well, Lucy, like Dr. Moore-Mensah up at Teachers College, who's really asking critical questions about the training of pre-service science teachers and the ways in which we understand concepts like culturally relevant pedagogy within the curriculum, or do we take social justice focused components to our curriculum? To me, is this idea of trying to redo how we even think about curriculum from a formal informal dichotomy to going into what you were saying, this more humanizing space in terms of understanding learning across the home environment, the community environment, the parents' workforce environment, and the formalized schools context, to engage more project-based or problem-based learning opportunities with anchor phenomena that are meaningful to the students. So that makes me think about some of Dr. Brian Brown's work out at Stanford and the work he is doing that is intimately connected to the Oakland, California community. So it's really trying to make learning meaningful, relevant, and mattering to those people so that they can not only see themselves as scientists, but then they can also unpack what my good friend, Dr. Rihanna Roby talks about, the science has done in their homes, given the grandmothers who are teaching them all of these recipes, or their uncles who are out there operating within their gardens or within their garages that are doing a lot of these innovative exploratory understandings and investigations.
Thank you, Terrell. Anyone else who would like to take on this question? Maybe Scott, do you have any specific examples? I know that you've done some work on this.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. When I think back to the STEM camp that I was involved in creating, directing, running, and thinking about the students that I interacted with and seeing their interests, thinking about their comments, when I asked them to compare their experience of learning science within the school setting versus camp, an interesting comment that came up was, they said, well, we don't really learn science at school within the science classroom. You know, that's more a career and technology education kind of program. So their activities, it's problem solving, it's, you know, trying to create a project to approach a complex situation, but they were oftentimes missing the connection then to science, what that meant. So they were saying, no, within the science classroom, we are not, you know, we are not banking that information, if you will. We're not connecting how these problem solving hands-on activities are connected back to science and science content. So that's at least one observation I've had.
Thank you very much. Any examples from Sweden or England on programs or curriculum materials? Okay, no. Thank you very much. There is another question that I think deserves, deserves attention, and I think by Alison Gonsalves. So Alison is kind of challenging us how we think about the process of becoming a form of science person as an ambition or aspiration. And she says, while we hope to reconstruct and widen what counts as a science person, becoming a science person itself seems to be a neoliberal ideal. Should this be our focus? What other goals might we have for science identities?
I can jumpstart. I think that that's a phenomenal question. And again, very context specific, thinking about why is there such an investment in having more scientists? So I know that there was this special issue led by Vakil and Ayers. I can't remember first name. I think Rick Ayers was one, who talked about the racialized and politicized notion of STEM within the United States and why we see our governmental agencies saying that we need more scientists as a way for the United States to be more globally competitive. And I don't know if those same messages are being sent sort of globally across other nations and countries, but we can ask that specific question and leverage that specific critique. But then we can also think about it through how Gloria Latson-Billings talks about this education debt, this moral imperative, and why it is that we should actually be engaging more diverse minds in scientific practice and scientific innovation, and thinking more broadly about scientific practice and scientific innovation because of what it affords the communities. So I think about, again, traditional science curriculum in post-secondary education. We have conversations about topics like water quality, but we don't necessarily make it localized to concepts like the Flint, Michigan water crisis and the ways in which we can leverage new minds to create better infrastructure to actually support people and communities in need. So it's this idea that can extend beyond this sort of neoliberal notion to thinking about what is best for the community and how the community can engage in practices and understandings and innovations that elevate their needs and their desires, their goals. So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think there is great value in thinking about the collective or the locality of science identity. But I would also like to add a bit on that, because I do recognize the risk in what Alison is articulating here. And I think we perhaps need to be careful also about how we think about how people become or are scientists, and perhaps be kind of more open in conceptualizing of the infinite ways that someone might become a science person instead of how someone might act, or someone might act in certain ways to be recognized as a scientist. And I think this is exactly where what Terrell is trying to bring in, the context, the locality, the subjectivity of the person and the communities where we live in.
Could I add on to this real quick? Because I'm thinking about the embodiment part of this, and I'm thinking about a comment of a child that I read after visiting a science lab and drawing a scientist before visiting a science lab and after visiting a science lab. And that student said, well, I figured that scientists are normal people with just not so normal jobs. And I think about the split of the scientist as embodying science versus the scientist being a human being that does a job. So I think also this is a myth of a scientist being a certain kind of person that then also feeds into this argument of you're born a scientist, right? So I think this tension between what is the myth, what is the myth that feeds the idea of a scientist to be a certain person versus it being valued as a certain profession, but taking the spotlight away from the body that is doing it, allowing all bodies to do it. So I've been thinking a lot when you've been discussing this about the embodiment of this and the context there.
Thank you, Katarina. I see a lot of questions, but I'm also cautious of the time, and there are quite a few people started leaving us. We are over time by 10 minutes.
May get booted out here in about 4 minutes. I extended it, but I didn't extend it for too long. So maybe one more question.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of questions we kind of address implicitly or explicitly, and other questions are more or like comments of people sharing thoughts or sharing concerns with us and asking how do we move forward, especially if we are
very good, thoughtful questions and comments. I really appreciate both engagement with all of that. So okay. Here's moving forward. I mean, this is supposed to be a series, right? Not just a one and done. And so I think we have started this series very, very successfully with some critical analysis and in-depth discussion of these really essential and important topics. So I've put in the chat, invited folks to suggest additional speakers. And if there are other related topics that you would like to have a focus of webinar, we now have this platform, and we seek your input so that we can put more of these together and continue our work, because this is really, really essential and important work. And I thank everybody for your questions, your thoughts, your comments. Thank you so much to the speakers. You guys have been awesome, wonderful. Our future is so bright with the young scholars coming up doing some amazing work. Thank you to Lucy, always a pleasure and always provoking with your ideas and inputs. And I look forward to continuing our work together. So any last minute comments from the panel?
Just thank you so much for putting this together, Renee, and thank you for the invitation for us to kick off the series.
So happy that we could do this. So I encourage everybody to be on the lookout for the next webinar announcement. Again, if you have ideas, please submit them. You can send stuff to me. You can send some information through the NARST website that now has a virtual events form. If you've got your own type of webinar or event you would like to have, you can submit it through there. So we are going to keep everybody engaged in great discussion. And we look forward to seeing you in Vancouver, British Columbia in March. Right, everybody, thank you so much again. Oh, and the recording will be made available. We will post it on the NARST YouTube channel, and we will send out an announcement when that is all ready.